The excavator's metal teeth tear through concrete like paper, water erupting in a geyser that crashes into Karen Morrison's pristine garden. She's screaming bloody murder at the construction crew, her manicured finger stabbing the air like a weapon. But when the police cruiser rolls up, lights flashing, it's not stopping for the workers, it's coming for her. 20 years of neighborhood tyranny. And Marcus finally found the one thing she couldn't steal, couldn't destroy, couldn't claim as her own, the truth buried in century-old property records that would make her the trespasser on his family's land. The sound of hydraulic machinery cutting through morning silence was nothing compared to the sound of Karen Morrison's voice reaching frequencies that could shatter crystal. Stop, stop, right now. She burst through the hedge, separating her pristine backyard from the chaos next door, her white silk robe billowing behind her like battle armor. You're destroying property value. This is illegal. Marcus Washington looked up from where he stood, directing the excavation crew, a grim smile playing at the corners of his mouth. At 62, he'd waited long enough for this moment. Long enough to watch this woman terrorize every family on Maple Street. Long enough to see her fake tears sway code enforcement officers. Long enough to bite his tongue while she filed complaint after complaint about his unsightly vegetable garden, his loud grandchildren, his inappropriate music during his late wife's memorial service. "Morning, Karen," he called out, his voice steady over the rumble of machinery. "Beautiful day for construction, don't you think?" The excavator's massive arms swung wide, its bucket scraping another chunk of concrete from what used to be the Morrison's elaborate in-ground pool, the pool that had been the crown jewel of Karen's backyard empire. The centerpiece of her legendary summer parties, where she'd deliberately exclude half the neighborhood while making sure they could hear every laugh, every splash, every reminder that they weren't invited. "You can't do this." Karen's voice cracked as she gestured wildly at the destruction. "That pool cost $40,000. We have permits. We have rights." "Actually," Marcus said, pulling a thick manila folder from under his arm. "You don't." The words hit Karen like cold water. Her face, already flushed with rage, went pale beneath her carefully applied morning makeup. "What are you talking about?" Marcus opened the folder, revealing decades-old documents, survey maps, and legal papers. "Turns out, that beautiful pool of yours, it's sitting on my property, has been for 7 years." The excavator operator, a weathered man named Joe Hood, seen enough neighborhood disputes to fill a book, paused his work to watch the show. His crew of 3 stood nearby, hard hats pushed back, enjoying the rare spectacle of a customer actually having their legal ducks in a row. "That's impossible," Karen sputtered. "We had it surveyed. We followed all the rules. You had it." "Surveyed by your brother-in-law's company," Marcus interrupted, his voice gaining strength with each word. "The same company that somehow managed to move your property line 6 feet into my backyard without bothering to check the original 1924 land grants." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Behind her, neighbors were beginning to emerge from their houses. Drawn by the commotion, Mrs. Chen from across the street stood on her front porch, arms crossed, a satisfied expression on her face. The Johnsons from 2 houses down were positioning themselves with clear sight lines to the drama, and even old Mr. Peterson, who rarely left his house anymore, had appeared at his front window. 7 years, Marcus continued, his voice carrying across the yard to the growing audience. 7 years you've been swimming in a pool built on my property. 7 years you've been hosting your little exclusive parties, making sure to remind everyone who was and wasn't welcome. 7 years of you calling the police on my grandkids for being too loud while you had 50 people screaming around a pool that was technically trespassing on my land. The color was returning to Karen's face, but now it was the deep red of pure fury. "You're lying. You're making this up because you're jealous, Mrs. Morrison." Joe, the excavator operator, called out, his gravelly voice cutting through her tirade. "You want to see the county records, because we don't dig up anybody's property without proper documentation." Marcus nodded to Joe, who reached into his truck cab and pulled out an official-looking packet of papers. County surveyor came out. Last week, confirmed everything. Karen snatched the papers from Joe's hands, her eyes scanning frantically. The documents were official, stamped, signed, and devastating. The truth was laid out in precise measurements and legal language. The Morrisons had built their dream pool on someone else's land. "But we've been here 7 years," she whispered, the fight draining out of her voice. Adverse possession doesn't apply in this county without explicit notification to the property owner, Marcus said. And seeing as how you never bothered to tell me you were building on my land, well, ... double quotes, he shrugged. Pools got to go. The excavator roared back to life, its bucket biting into another section of concrete. Water still draining from the broken pipes, mixed with chunks of cement and tile, creating a muddy soup that was already seeping toward Karen's prized rose garden. This is revenge. Karen screamed, her composure completely shattered now. This is harassment. You're doing this because you hate me. I'm doing this because I'm finally building that workshop my wife always wanted me to have, Marcus replied. Calmly, the workshop I couldn't build because there was a pool sitting on the spot where it was supposed to go. Karen's eyes went wide. Workshop? You're tearing up a $40,000 pool to build a workshop. $40,000 pool that was never yours to build, Marcus corrected. And yeah, I'm building a workshop, going to teach neighborhood kids woodworking, maybe some basic construction skills. Community outreach, you might call it. Irony wasn't lost on anyone watching. Karen Morrison, who had spent years complaining about property values and neighborhood aesthetics, had been the one decreasing property values by building an illegal structure. Marcus Washington, whom she'd painted as the problem neighbor, was planning to give back to the community. You can't do this, Karen said again, but her voice had lost its edge. She was looking around desperately, as if hoping to find someone, anyone, who would take her side. But the faces watching from porches and doorways weren't sympathetic. They were satisfied. Some were openly smiling. Mrs. Chen called out from across the street, "About time someone stood up to you, Karen." "Good for you, Marcus," shouted Dave Johnson. "That woman's been a nightmare for years." Karen spun around, her robe whipping dramatically. "You're all just jealous. Jealous because we have nice things, because we maintain our property, because you built your nice things on other people's property," Mrs. Chen shot back. "How many times did you call the police on my teenagers for playing music too loud while you had pool parties until midnight?" The crowd was growing bolder, years of suppressed frustration spilling out. Other voices joined in. "Remember when she tried to get the Henderson's tree cut down because it dropped leaves in her yard? She called animal control on my cat for. Walking through her garden, she tried to get my kid's basketball hoop removed because she said it was an eyesore." Karen found herself surrounded by an impromptu tribunal of neighbors, each one eager to catalog her years of petty tyranny. The excavator continued its work, methodically destroying the symbol of her neighborhood dominance, while she stood helpless. "To stop it, this isn't over," she said, her voice shaking with rage and humiliation. "I'm calling my lawyer. I'm calling the city. I'm calling everyone." "You do that?" Marcus said. "But while you're making your calls, you might want to pack up anything you don't want to get wet. Joe estimates we'll hit the main drain line in about an hour. And when that goes, it's going to flood everything from here to your back patio." Karen's eyes went wide with panic. Her outdoor furniture, her expensive landscaping, her meticulously maintained garden, all of it, was about to be soaked with chlorinated pool water mixed with construction debris. She turned and ran toward her house, robe flying, her shouts of "Richard, Richard," echoing across the neighborhood as she screamed for her husband. Marcus watched her go, then nodded to Joe. "Keep digging." The excavator's bucket took another massive bite out of the pool's concrete shell. Water geysered up, catching the morning sunlight in a brief, beautiful rainbow before crashing down into the growing crater. From somewhere inside the Morrison house came the sound of doors slamming, voices raised in argument, and Karen's unmistakable shriek of "do something." Marcus pulled his phone from his pocket and scrolled to a number he'd been saving for just this moment. The call connected on the second ring, County Sheriff's Office. "Hi, this is Marcus Washington on Maple Street. I need to report trespassing and possible theft of utilities. I've got someone who's been illegally using my property for 7 years, and when I started lawful construction on my own land, they became hostile and threatening." As he spoke, he watched Karen's back door fly open. She emerged like a hurricane, still in her robe, phone pressed to her ear, gesturing wildly at the excavation. Officer Maria Santos had been responding to calls on Maple Street for 3 years, and she knew the address by heart. And one memorable incident, involving a neighbor's cat that had somehow become a vicious animal attack, in Karen's version of events. But as the cruiser pulled up to 1247 Maple Street, something was different. Usually, Karen was the one standing on her pristine front lawn, pointing accusingly at some neighbor's perceived transgression. Today, she was standing in 6 inches of muddy water, her white silk robe soaked and stained, screaming into her phone while an excavator methodically demolished what used to be her backyard oasis. "Don't care what it costs. Get down here." Now, they're destroying everything. Karen's voice carried across the street, her usual composed demeanor completely shattered. Officer Santos stepped out of her cruiser, noting the crowd of neighbors that had gathered, more neighbors than she'd ever seen voluntarily in Karen Morrison's vicinity. Most were smiling. A few were openly recording with their phones. "Morning, folks," Santos called out, her hand resting casually on her radio. "Got a call about a disturbance?" Marcus Washington approached, his step confident, his manner calm. "That would be my call, Officer Santos. I'm reporting trespassing and harassment." Karen spun around, nearly losing her footing in the muddy. "Water? Harassment? I'm the one being harassed. They're destroying my property, actually," Marcus said, pulling out his manila folder, now somewhat damp from the pool water spray. "They're removing an illegal structure from my property." Officer Santos had worked enough property disputes to recognize the signs of a complicated situation. "Let me see those documents." As Marcus handed over the surveyor's report and property records, Karen waded through the muddy water toward them, her designer slippers squelching with each step. "This is ridiculous. We've lived here for 7 years. That pool cost $40,000. How much something costs doesn't make it legal," Santos replied, scanning the official documents. The county stamps were legitimate, the surveyor's measurements were precise, and the property boundaries were clear as day. "Mrs. Morrison, according to these records, your pool extends significantly onto Mr. Washington's property." "But we didn't know," Karen protested. "Our surveyor was your brother-in-law," Marcus interrupted. "And even if you didn't know, ignorance of property boundaries doesn't give you squatter's rights." The excavator operator had paused his work to watch the proceedings, but the damage was already catastrophic. What had once been an elegant kidney-shaped pool was now a crater filled with broken concrete, twisted metal, and muddy water. "Kitchen," and was creeping toward her back patio. "Of course we did. Based on a fraudulent survey," Marcus added. "I've got copies of the original permit applications. They list dimensions and boundaries that don't match the actual property lines. It wasn't just about a property dispute. This was about years of accumulated injustice, finally finding its resolution." Mrs. Morrison Santos said carefully, "I'm going to need to see your permits and survey documents." Karen's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to speak. "They're there in the house. Richard has them." "Richard," she screamed toward her back door. "Get out here now." The back door of the Morrison house opened, and Richard Morrison emerged, looking like a man who'd been dreading this moment for years. Tall and thin, with prematurely gray hair and the perpetually worried expression of someone married to a hurricane, he approached the group with visible reluctance. "Hello, Officer Santos," he said quietly. "I suppose this was inevitable." "Richard," Karen snapped, "tell them about the permits. Tell them about the survey." But Richard Morrison just stood there, his shoulders sagging, looking at the destroyed pool with something that might have been relief. "I can't, Karen, because there's something I never told you about that survey." The silence that followed, it was so complete that even the excavator operator leaned forward to hear better. "What are you talking about?" Karen's voice was dangerously quiet. Richard looked at his wife, then at Officer Santos, then at Marcus. The survey was wrong. "I knew it was wrong. Tommy, your brother, he made a mistake with the measurements, and when I realized it, I tried to bring it up," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Remember when I suggested maybe we should get a second opinion, maybe build the pool closer to the house? But you said Tommy was family, that we could trust him, that I was just being paranoid." Karen was staring at her husband with an expression of pure betrayal. "You let me build a pool on someone else's property. You let me spend $40,000 on someone else's property. I thought maybe nobody would notice," Richard said. Miserably, "I thought maybe it would be okay. 7 years, Karen screamed. 7 years I've been maintaining a pool, paying for chemicals, paying for cleaning, hosting parties on his property. She pointed at Marcus like he was personally responsible for her husband's deception. Marcus, who had been watching this domestic drama unfold with fascination, finally spoke up. Actually, about those parties, Officer Santos raised an eyebrow. Yes, every single one of those pool parties was on my property, which means every noise complaint she ever filed about my family gatherings. Every time she called the police about my grandkids being too loud, she was doing it while literally trespassing on my land. The irony was so perfect that Mrs. Chen started applauding from across the street. Karen looked around at the crowd, at her neighbors celebrating her humiliation, at her husband's betrayal, at the ruins of her backyard empire. "This is a setup," she said, her voice taking on a desperate edge. "This is conspiracy. You all planned this together. Permits, but I didn't know they were fraudulent." "Maybe not," Santos agreed, "but your husband did, and filing false documents with the county is a felony." Richard Morrison went white as a sheet. Fraudulent permits, falsified surveys, knowing construction on land you don't own. Complaints. Karen was spiraling now, her perfect world crumbling faster than the concrete in her backyard. Harassment charges. I was protecting my property values. I was maintaining neighborhood standards. You were calling the police on children for playing in their own backyard while you were illegally occupying someone else's property, Santos replied. "That's going to look real good in court." Marcus stepped forward, and for a moment his expression softened. "Karen, I don't want to destroy your life. I just want to build my workshop. I want to use my own property for my own purposes. We'll pay you. We'll buy the land." "Well, it's not for sale," Marcus said firmly. "That land has been in my family for 60 years. My father built his first house on that lot. My wife planted her first garden there. I'm not selling it so you can keep a pool you should never have built." The excavator roared back to life, and Joe called out from the cab. "Mr. Washington, we're about to hit the electrical lines for the pool lights. You want us to shut those off first?" Electrical lines. Officer Santos looked sharply at Karen. "Did you run electrical lines onto Mr. Washington's property?" Karen's face went from pale to green. We? "Unauthorized electrical work on someone else's property," Santos said, making notes. "That's another violation. Mrs. Morrison, I'm going to need you to contact your utility company immediately and have those lines disconnected, but that will kill power to half our backyard." "Should have thought of that before you built on someone else's land," Marcus said. The crowd of neighbors was growing larger, and several people were now openly filming the proceedings. Karen noticed the cameras and seemed to realize for the first time that this disaster was being documented for posterity. "Stop recording," she screamed at the crowd. "This is private property." "Actually," called out Dave Johnson from 2 houses down, "we're standing on public property. And what you're doing is newsworthy." "Newsworthy?" Mrs. Chen grinned. "My daughter works for Channel 7. She's very interested in stories about property disputes and neighborhood bullies." Knees buckled slightly. "Karen," said Mrs. Chen, her voice carrying years of suppressed frustration, "you've made this neighborhood miserable for 7 years. You've called the police on everyone's children, complained about everyone's pets, tried to..." The fire truck's arrival brought Chief Danny Rodriguez, a man who'd been dealing with Karen Morrison's emergency calls for longer than he cared to remember. As he stepped down from the cab, surveying the electrical wires dangling into pools of muddy water, he already knew this was going to be a complicated day. "Santos," he nodded to the police officer. "What's the situation?" "Illegal construction, fraudulent permits, and now electrical hazards," she replied. "Oh, and 7 years of harassment that just got turned inside out." Chief Rodriguez looked at Karen, who was still standing in the muddy water, her expensive robe now resembling a disaster relief blanket. "Mrs. Morrison, we need to shut off power to this entire section immediately. Those exposed wires are a serious hazard." "You can't do that," Karen protested, though her voice lacked its usual commanding tone. "We have food in the refrigerator. We have medical equipment. Ma'am, we can't leave live electrical wires exposed in standing water. It's a matter of public safety." As if summoned by the word safety, another official vehicle pulled up, this one from the county building inspector's office. Out stepped Janet Walsh, a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair, and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen every construction scam in the book. "Somebody called about unpermitted construction and electrical hazards," she announced. Pulling out a tablet and camera, Marcus stepped forward. "That would be me, Ms. Walsh. I've got documentation showing illegal construction on my property, fraudulent permits, and unauthorized utility connections." Janet Walsh began photographing the scene, her camera clicking steadily as she documented the destroyed pool, the electrical hazards, and the property boundaries. "How long has this structure been in place?" 7 years, Marcus replied. 7 years of unpermitted electrical work, Walsh muttered, making notes. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm going to need to see all your permits, contractor licenses, and electrical inspection certificates." Karen looked desperately at Richard, who was now sitting on their back steps with his head in his hands. "Richard, tell her about the permits." But Richard Morrison had reached his breaking point. "There are no permits, Janet," he said quietly. "Not real ones. Tommy filed them using incorrect property boundaries, and the electrical work, we had our neighbor's cousin do it, off the books." The silence that followed was profound. Even the excavator operator turned off his engine to hear better. "Off-the-books electrical work," Walsh repeated, her voice deadly calm, "connected to county utilities. On someone else's property." She looked at Karen with the expression of a professional who'd just discovered a particularly egregious violation. "Mrs. Morrison, do you understand the liability you've created here?" "Liability?" Karen's voice was barely a whisper. "If someone had been electrocuted in that pool that was illegally constructed with unauthorized electrical work, you would have been facing criminal charges. Manslaughter, at minimum." The crowd of neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Many of them had children. Many of those children had friends who might have been invited to pool parties over the years. The magnitude of what could have happened was suddenly, terrifyingly clear. Mrs. Chen stepped forward from the crowd. "Officer Santos, I want to file a complaint, ma'am. 7 years ago, Karen Morrison called child services on my family because she said my teenagers were unsupervised and dangerous. When they were playing in our own backyard, she claimed they were a threat to neighborhood safety. Turns out, the real threat was her illegal pool with unauthorized electrical work." A murmur ran through the crowd as the implications sank in. Other voices began to speak up. "She called the health department on us for having a vegetable garden, said it was unsanitary. She reported my home business to the city, claimed I was violating zoning laws. She tried to get my elderly mother's home condemned, said it was bringing down property values." Officer Santos was taking notes furiously. "Folks, if you want to file formal complaints about harassment, false reporting, or filing fraudulent emergency calls, I can help you with that." Karen was backing away from the crowd, her eyes wide with panic. "This is insane. You're all ganging up on me." "I was trying to protect the neighborhood by breaking the law for 7 years, Marcus asked quietly. "I didn't know I was breaking the law." "But I did," Richard said, finally standing up from the steps. His voice was stronger now, as if finally telling the truth had given him courage. "I knew, and I should have stopped it, but I was too much of a coward to deal with your reaction." Karen stared at her husband with an expression of complete betrayal. "How could you do this to me? How could I do this to you?" Richard's voice rose for the first time in years. "Karen, you've made enemies of every family on this street. You've called the police on children for playing. You've tried to get people's pets taken away. You've filed false complaints with every city department. You've made our neighbors' lives miserable for years." "I was maintaining standards. You were being a bully," Richard shouted. "And I enabled you because I was too weak to stand up to you, but I'm done. I'm done pretending that what we did was okay. I'm done watching you terrorize our neighbors. I'm done." The neighborhood fell silent. In 7 years, no one had ever heard Richard Morrison raise his voice to his wife. Karen's face cycled through several emotions: shock, anger, humiliation, and finally, something that looked almost like fear. "Richard, you can't mean I've already called my brother. I'm staying with him tonight, and tomorrow I'm calling a lawyer about filing those corrected property documents and getting this mess sorted out legally. You're leaving me?" "I'm leaving this." Richard gestured at the ruined backyard, the crowd of angry neighbors, the official vehicles. "I'm leaving 7 years of lies and harassment and making other people miserable. If you want to come with me, you need to acknowledge what we did wrong and start making it right." Karen looked around desperately at the ruins of her pool, at the neighbors who were no longer afraid of her, at the officials documenting every violation, at her husband who had finally found his backbone. For the first time in 7 years, she had no power, no leverage, no way to control the situation. "This isn't over," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Actually," said Janet Walsh, looking up from her tablet, "it kind of is. Mrs. Morrison, I'm issuing citations for unpermitted construction, illegal electrical work, and fraudulent permit applications. The fines start at $50,000, and that's before we factor in the utility theft and potential criminal charges. $50,000, plus the cost of professional electrical inspection and remediation, plus any legal fees from Mr. Washington's property damage claims, plus potential criminal penalties if the county prosecutor decides to pursue charges for filing fraudulent documents." Karen's knees gave out, and she sat down hard in the muddy water. Marcus watched her for a moment, then walked over and offered her his hand. "Karen," she looked up at him with tear-filled eyes. "I meant what I said earlier. I don't want to destroy your life, but this stops now. No more harassment, no more false complaints, no more making our neighbors miserable because you think you're better than everyone else." Karen stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to apologize. To everyone. And I want you to mean it. And if I do, then maybe we can work out a payment plan for the damages instead of letting the lawyers handle everything. Maybe we can resolve this as neighbors instead of enemies." Karen looked around at the faces watching her, Mrs. Chen, the Johnsons, old Mr. Peterson, a dozen other neighbors she'd antagonized over the years. She looked at her husband, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. She looked at the officials who held her financial future in their tablets and citation books. Finally, slowly, she reached up and took Marcus's hand, letting him help her to her feet. Double quotes. She started, then stopped. The words seemed to stick in her throat. "Take your time," Marcus said gently. Karen looked at Mrs. Chen. "I'm sorry I called child services on your family. Your kids weren't doing anything wrong." Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. "Thank you." Karen turned to the Johnsons. "I'm sorry about the complaints about your basketball hoop, and the barbecues, and ... and all of it." One by one, she made her way through the crowd, apologizing for years of harassment, false complaints, and petty tyranny. She seemed to shrink a little, the imperious neighborhood queen transforming into someone who was finally genuinely ashamed of her behavior. When she was done, she turned back to Marcus. "I'm sorry I made your life difficult. I'm sorry about the complaints about your family. I'm sorry about the pool. I didn't know it was on your property, but that doesn't make it right." Marcus nodded. Apology accepted. Officer Santos closed her notebook. "All right, folks. I think we can handle the rest of this without charges flying in every direction. Mrs. Morrison, you'll need to work with Mr. Washington and the county to resolve the property issues and pay for the damages. But if everyone can act like adults, maybe we can keep this out of criminal court." Janet Walsh was less forgiving. "The building code violations still stand. Those fines are non-negotiable, and you'll need professional remediation for the electrical hazards." Chief Rodriguez nodded. "We'll need power shutoff